Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy,
where we're expanding the conversation around Catholic sexuality.
We're your hosts, Ellen and Kathleen. All right, here we are back with another Charting Toward Intimacy episode.
We are back.
Kathleen and I are here, and today we are talking about why contraception isn't an option. Just as humans, I was going to say as Catholics, but like as humans, contraception is not an option. And we're just going to dig into, how like contraception really dehumanizes us. I think a lot of times we see conversation around, just in the social media world when people are talking about how difficult NFP is. And it's like, man, I wish I could just use a condom or take the pill, or people are trying to decide between the two. Maybe in marriage prep, they're trying to decide. And this episode, what we're talking about is like, why that's not even a choice. Like, that's not even an option. It shouldn't even be an option. And just kind of like, why behind that? So,
yeah. And, I think we say this with a lot of our episodes, but we don't want this. The point of this is not to be preachy, right? Like, this is what, because believe me, I myself have been in a position where it's like, my gosh, do I just wish I could take a pill or use a condom or something, you know what I mean?
Right. And I think that's human nature, is like, we want things to be easier.
We do.
And I think uncomfortable to be. And
I think it's like now more than ever in the 21st century, things are so easy for us. We can literally say, Alexa, do this, Google, do that, Siri, do this, right? And
I don't even have to walk over and flip off the light switch in my house.
Exactly.
Actually, but some of them I do, and it's pain, like some of my lights are connected to my Google Home and some of them aren't. And I'm always like, oh, I wish I didn't have to walk across the room.
I'm not going to lie. I don't have an Alexa or a Google anything because I know I'll just become the laziest person in the world. It's not good for me. It's not good for any of us in this house. So, but really, like, we are so adverse to suffering and hardship in the 21st century than I think anybody has ever been before. Not to say we don't have our sufferings and our hardships. Of course we do. We always will. But we're so much more inclined to ask, why me? Why this? Why can't I? Than I think any other generation before us.
You're really calling us out here, but I think you're speaking the truth.
I'm calling myself out too, right? I am a millennial. I'm sorry. I am. I can't help it, but it's something I've really been personally reflecting on lately, is how spoiled I am as a millennial, and how I'm so afraid of suffering in so many little ways, when it's like, holy crap, my grandparents, my great grandparents, right? Like, all the people that have come before me had it so much worse. So, so I think this is something that we are very much naturally wanting to say, why can't I just?
Yeah.
Right. And that we do, like, even us kind of have practicing for, 10 plus years, practicing NFP or fertility awareness. And kind of knowing all the answers already, are still inclined to ask that question.
Right.
So it's sort of proving.
I think it's important to just mention here, it is not wrong to ask that question.
Never. Yeah.
Where you miss the mark, where the sin lies in this whole thing that we're talking about, is when you harbor anger toward God. And after when you ask this question, or when you if you do actually turn over to, in this case, contraception, right?
Correct.
That would, pride. There's obviously the sin right there.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's like, it's always okay to ask God, why things are going on. But it's not okay to then just leave it at that and be like angry.
To dismiss, I would say,
Yeah.
like church authority, you know, which we believe has been given to us from the Holy Spirit. Yeah. So let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it. Why don't you pull your Humana Vitae quote that you have? Let's just chat about
which one, 23 or 27?
Oh,
page 27.
Let's do the first one.
All right. So let's talk. I was paging through Humana Vitae last night, and I was just like, I need to read this multiple times a year. First of all, it's 40 pages. It's like short.
Humana Vitae, and again, for any of you guys who are new to Humana Vitae is papal encyclical that was written by Pope Paul VI, and this was the definitive reconfirmation of where the church stood on contraception. A lot of people misunderstand that Humana Vitae was like the church saying, oh yeah, okay, now that contraception has come up, now we disagree with it. That's not what it was. It was a reconfirmation of what the church had always stood for. Because this came out in the 50s. Oh, the date is 60s. Thank you. 64, right?
60. Yep.
And this was when the pill had come about. Condoms had been available for many years prior to that, as well as methods of contraception like pulling out. Those had always been dismissed by the church as, not in line with the natural law. The question of contraception in the form of the birth control pill came up, and there was a need for a reconfirmation. So anyway,
yes,
not to beat a dead horse, but that's what Humana Vitae is.
For anyone that doesn't know what it is, so the section that I was really drawn to last night was in section 13 of Humana Vitae, which talks about faithfulness to God's design. So I'm going to read a couple little blurbs here, but man and woman must also recognize that an act of mutual love, which impairs the capacity to transmit life, which God, the creator, through specific laws has built into it, frustrates his design, which constitutes the norm of marriage and contradicts the will of the author of life. So this is talking about having to remain faithful to God's design, and why contraception cannot be allowed because it does not remain faithful to God's design. Further on, it says, to experience the gift of married love while respecting the laws of conception, aka not contracepting, is to acknowledge that one is not the master of the sources of life, but rather the minister of the design established by the Creator. Now, I'm going to just say that I have been on this kick lately about how NFP needs to be universally recognized or defined as fertility awareness plus like prayer and discernment. Right?
I think we've been on this kick for
we've been on this kick, and I've been on this kick in every social group in my life right now. Right.
Please stop saying that NFP is the same thing as fertility awareness, because it's not. Fertility awareness is the science behind it. Yeah. NFP requires that natural family planning is family planning in line with the natural law that God designed of our bodies and in line with God's will.
Yes.
That utilizes fertility awareness.
Exactly. Like they are not one and the same. They can't be one and the same. And, like Pope Paul VI here, just like he spits that truth that like we have to recognize if we are going to take on the vocation of marriage, like we stand at the altar and we promise to accept children lovingly from God, right? Like we have to recognize that we are not he says, master of the sources of life.
Yeah.
That's not our job, right? We are co-creators. But I think today it's the cultural norm and the expectation that we say when we want children, right? And And it's not always the case. I mean, we can go a ton into responsible parenthood and when to not have children. And, all of that is totally licit, right? As long as we're doing it through licit means. But it comes down to really respecting that, like with contraception, we are trying to be the master of the source of life.
Right.
We're trying to say, no, not right now. It's not the time. Right. And rather than giving that to God, sometimes to just be like, you know what, like, I need to surrender this to you because I am not the master of life. You are. Right. And that's that's where the discernment piece of NFP really comes in. And why contraception is just, it tempts us to really be the master. We are like trying to essentially be our own God and to say, what we want and when we want it, which is a total millennial thing. Let's like be real.
Right. I mean, this all harkens back to just like the ease of our society. Like,
yes,
we think also then that family life, creating a family should be easy. And that we should get it when we want it. And that's not the case. That's not how it works. Part of that quote, the first one that you read, used the word frustrates in a really interesting way. So I went ahead and Googled the etymology of frustrate, which is actually from the Latin verb frustra, or frustrare is the verb. But frustra means in vain. Right? So when you frustrate something, you're like acting against its nature in vain.
Yeah, for no real reason.
For no real reason and no purpose, and no like really end. And I just thought that was really interesting, right? So like when you're separating this unitive and procreative meaning of the conjugal act, you are frustrating the design, and you're acting in vain.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to pull in from just theology of the body as a whole, and I think what a lot of people don't know is that theology of the body was actually a response to something that was written in Humana Vitae. There was a call for Pope Paul VI said, hey, we need an adequate anthropology of man in order to like understand this further, in order to understand what we're talking about when we mean, these unitive and procreative meanings and the natural design. And so John Paul II was like, great. Well, actually, Karol Wojtyła at the time, because he wrote it before he became Pope, he was like, I will respond to that. And this is where theology of the body came from. It's this adequate anthropology. It's this this anthropology of man, what it means to be human. And then at the very end of the theology of the body, of the ending, like roughly 14 audiences or so, John Paul II then like wraps it all up and brings it back to Humana Vitae and is like, okay, now that we have all of this background, let's dive into what Humana Vitae says even more so that we can understand it better. So one of the things that theology of the body talks about is the language of the body, and that the body speaks. And, you can see that when in nonverbal communication, right? If I'm sitting across from you with my arms crossed and I'm looking at the ground, that says something very different than if I'm sitting across from you, sitting up straight, making eye contact with you. And I haven't said a word, right? But I've said a lot about what I think about you and how I feel that day. And, I've said a lot, right? So we can speak with our body. One of the most profound ways that we can speak with our body as humans is when we unite in the conjugal act. We are called as humans to speak the truth. The truth is that we are made in the image and likeness of God. God is the creator. He made us in the image and likeness of his creative ability.
Mm-hmm.
So when we unite in this conjugal act, this is the way that human can speak. I mean, there's lots of other ways to speak, but it's like, this is a big deal. And so we're called to speak the truth. We don't have to speak. If we are not ready to speak the truth with our body, God calls us to not speak. And that's what abstinence is it's us saying, oh, you know what? We actually don't want to have a child right now. And the only way to truthfully speak with our bodies is to actually just not speak right now, right? To actually not come together in the conjugal act right now.
Yeah. And I like love that point. You said that, you said it before we started recording that, what did you say?
Oh,
if you don't have something nice to say, don't say
yeah,
it.
everybody knows that phrase. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say it at all, right? If you're not ready to have a baby, don't have sex.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's the same thing. If you don't have something truthful to say, don't say anything.
Don't say it. That's exactly it. If you don't have something truthful to say with your body, don't say it.
Yeah. If you are not willing to truthfully enter into the conjugal act with an openness to God's will, knowing that you are coming together during a fertile window and the probability of pregnancy is at roughly 33%.
Yeah.
And you're not ready to have a child. And maybe for you, it's like at probably 98% because you've just always gotten pregnant really easily. If you're not ready to speak the truth and truthfully tell God, I am open to what you have to give in this moment, then don't speak.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really good, analogy for it. It's not even really an analogy. It's like actual truth, but, but I want to go back to what you said about our bodies communicating and being made imago Dei, right? Like in the image of God. We are created in the image of God. So I was watching Father Mike Schmitz's video. Shout out, Father Mike.
We love Father Mike Schmitz on this podcast.
We love him. But his video his Ascension Presents video where he answered the question, why not contraception or IVF? And he just does it so well. He's just so compassionate and he does a great job. But, he talks about how the nature of things, right? And how to know something's nature, we need to look at what it's for, right? And so he uses the example of a chair and a table, right? So a chair is a chair because what is it made for? It is made for sitting, therefore it is a chair, right? And how sometimes you could use a chair to put something on it as if it were a table. And it's not exactly what it was made for, but it doesn't totally denature it, right? Now, if you use a chair, this was his example. So full credit to Father Mike here. If you use a chair to maybe set up a log and start chopping wood, right? Very quickly, you will denature that chair because it will no longer be able to be used to sit in, right?
Yeah.
So this whole talk about nature, right? And so if we're looking at ourselves as humans, right? We are created in the image of God for God himself, right? So talking about how our bodies communicate, not only do they communicate, emotion or, feeling to each other, we also communicate God to each other, right? It is in our nature to communicate God, to be an image of God to others, especially to our spouse. And what we're talking about with, sex and the conjugal act, we communicate something intense about God and about who he is. right? Through this act. So what do we do? Our fertility, the way we are created, with men being constantly fertile, women being only sometimes fertile, that like collaboration of fertility is in its design communicates something about God.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do with contraception? Right? We talk about, and you guys may have heard this, that, oh yeah, contraception denatures the human person. But if you're kind of the human person in question here, and you're just like, I feel fine. I don't feel denatured by this. I feel pretty good. I feel pretty safe. I feel pretty great, about when I don't have the potential for pregnancy. But let's talk about, in light of this now, in light of being made in the image of God, how does this denature us? If our fertility and the way it's designed is communicating something about God to our spouse, right, reciprocally, then to put something up that either renders us sterile or blocks that fertility, right, is to take away what we were created to do, which is to mirror God. Right? So it does. If our nature, if to know our nature, we need to look at what it's for, what we're for. To block that thing that communicates God in our bodies is completely denaturing us. Right. It's like, what are we for if not to be God and to communicate God to others?
In Ephesians 5, St. Paul talks about how man and woman coming together is a sign of the great mystery of Christ marrying his bride, the church, this relationship that God wants to have with us. So our marriage is a sign of that fertility, right? Mm-hmm. That fertile relationship, that there's this fertility of faith and hope and love, right? And these physical children are a sign of that fertility, of that faith, hope, and love. Love in particular, I think. And when we contracept the act, we are turning the sign that conjugal love is into a counter sign, into an anti-sign, an anti-sacrament, if you will, right? We are actually saying like the opposite of what we said in our wedding vows.
Yeah.
And therefore, like we're becoming the opposite of the sign we're supposed to be to the world, right, of Christ's love to his church.
Yeah.
There's a couple of quotes at the end of Theology of the Body that I think are a really great place to kind of end, just some things to think about and have in your mind. So when the conjugal act, this is from his 123rd address. When the conjugal act is deprived of its inner truth because it is deprived artificially of its procreative capacity, it also ceases to be an act of love. That's kind of what I was talking about with like our marriages are this sign, this image of this sacrament of, little s sacrament, of God's love to the church and the fertility that exists in that relationship. And that fertility has faith, hope, and love, right? And so when we are ripping apart the meanings of this conjugal act, we're no longer being a sign of that love.
Yeah.
And that's pretty harsh language.
It is.
Like that's, and it's okay if you're listening to this right now and like that just stabbed a knife in your stomach. It's okay. Mm-hmm. Like bring that to God. Bring that to Mary. Ask Mary to be your mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then here's another quote. One can say that in the case of an artificial separation of these two meanings in the conjugal act, a real bodily union is brought about, but it does not correspond to the inner truth and dignity of personal communion. right? So we still come together. There's still a union, but it's not speaking to the true dignity of our humanity and the true purpose of our humanity, which is openness to the Creator and openness to creation and openness to His will.
Yeah. I love that. I feel like maybe we could put up a Q box after this episode on Instagram.
Yeah. I think we will, because I think that this topic brings a lot of thoughts. And we'd love to hear your thoughts, you know?
I would love to hear the thoughts. And I think that in a half hour, there's so much more that could be said and answered. And it probably just brought up more questions for anybody listening than answers. So, you know, maybe some gripes, and that's cool. We love that. Like, let's wrestle with these things, you know, to come to know truth. We're not called to be ignorant to the truth. We're called to understand it.
Right.
So let's maybe do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely like go find us on Instagram. You know, links are in the show notes for those kind of things. Because let's continue this conversation. It's a tough one. It's one that's not had very much. So let's have it. Let's have this conversation. And we want to hear from you guys. If you know, if you're like, I'm not getting it, I disagree, all of those things. Or if you're like, wow, this totally opened my eyes, we want to hear it all. So come find us. Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.